I've agreed to talk tonight about the history of Wittunga, which is the history of 4 generations of the Ashby family. And as Rob said, I'm the 3rd generation down. Actually, I'm the 4th generation down. But tonight I really am going to talk about 5 generations, because all my children have also contributed towards tonight. One of my daughters did a school project on Wittunga more than 20 years ago, her geography project. She took many photos, and I'm showing quite a number of those this evening. Another of my children made a lot of old black and white and sepia slides, sepia prints into slides for tonight. My eldest daughter owned the horse, which you'll see tonight, and this was the last of the grazing animals on Wittunga Farm before it completely turned into a botanic gardens. And the 4th of my children is here tonight. He's going to record my words and see that I don't use the wrong ones. So now I think we'll start looking at the slides. Thank you. Some of you will have been to Wittunga Gardens. Is this your image of Wittunga, or is your image of Wittunga one of the beautiful flowers, the South African flowers in the springtime? For me, when I think of Wittunga, I think of Wittunga House and the front gate posts looking rather as I knew it for my younger part of my life. This is Edwin Ashby, my grandfather. He was the one who started Wittunga. He was an enthusiast. I think you can see that by his eyes, can't you? A very, very enthusiastic person. He was born in England in 1861 and came to Australia. He migrated to Australia in 1888, coming out with one of his sisters to live here. They were of Quaker lineage. Now, this meant with Quaker families that when you went somewhere, there was always plenty of people to welcome you. And Edwin, as his sister Meta, joined the small Quaker community which was gradually growing in the colony of South Australia. They found many friends there. Edwin joined the firm of Saunders. It became Saunders and Ashby. This was a real estate firm. So in those days you could be a very good conservationist and also a real estate agent. I don't think that necessarily follows now. He was a very good naturalist. His particular areas of interest were insects, particularly butterflies, birds, including the brilliant hummingbirds, shells, and in particular the marine mollusk chitons. They were one of his specialties, and in addition plants. So he had a very broad range of interests. In 1890, he married Esther Coleman, who was already a 4th generation Australian. Surely not that much, no, must have been 3rd generation Australian. Her mother had come out as a little girl, 6 years old, on a sailing ship. Her mother, Lucy Coleman later, lived to be well over 90 and spent the last 20 years of her life in Wittunga. This is the family group on the eastern veranda of Wittunga about 1910. So my story is about all of these people and others. Edwin Ashby is standing in the centre at the back. Ivan Ashby is the man on your left at the back, one of Edwin's sons. On the right-hand side is Keith. That's my father, the other son. In the front you have Esther, Edwin's wife. And the elderly lady on the right-hand side That's Lucy Coleman, the matriarch of the family. When that was taken, she would have been about 80 years old, I think. And in the centre is Alison Ashby, whom you will know of as the botanical artist. At that stage, Alison had already decided that she was going to paint every South Australian wildflower, and if possible, every Australian wildflower. The firm of Saunders and Ashby had bought most of the land where Eden Hills now is, and it was a portion of this land that became Edwin Ashby's farm and home. Edwin built his house, Wittunga, on the corner, really on the eastern margin of Eden Hills. He built his house in a patch of virgin scrub. However, the property of Wittunga at that time wasn't all scrub. Some of it was already cleared. The family moved up into the house in 1902, despite the fact that some of the brochures you will have read say 1901. It was in fact 1902. This is the first picture we have taken from Wittunga front door. Edwin Ashby is in the front on the left, then Keith Ashby and Ivan, the two boys. Ivan and Keith were off to school. Edwin was off to the office in town. There was a good train service. The trains from Blackwood station, the railway line had opened in 1888, and we're now this is 1903, this one. We're now looking up towards the township of Blackwood. Wittunga wasn't the first house built in the area. You can see a house behind Edwin and Keith. That's the Trotts' old home. We're looking towards the front gate and you can see the road going up towards Blackwood. As the scrub around the house, which had just been built, as the scrub was removed, so the garden was gradually formed. This shot shows the vegetable garden with Alison and Keith, two of the children, standing in the vegetable garden. Behind them you can see a cleared area, and that was the beginning of the first part of the orchard. That's what we called the home orchard. A large variety of different fruit trees and nut trees were planted there. And behind it you can see the scrub land. These days we would call it grey box woodland. That's what it is. Eucalyptus microcarpa and Eucalyptus leucoxamum. A woodland with space and understory plants between. Now we can see a little bit of the formal garden beginning. There was always an aunt or two at Wittunga. In the centre front there we have Alison Ashby, aged about 8, with a very big hat on, and she's weeding a border of pansies. With her is Auntie Meta. I think that one's Auntie Meta. There was Auntie Meta and Auntie Louie, and both of them stayed at various times at Wittunga. Meta was the one who had come out with Edwin from England. We're looking at Wittunga House from the position where the lake now is. So we're looking at the house from its south side. It doesn't look like the house now. Wittunga grew. It grew with the family. There were many alterations over the years. One thing you'll notice, in every one of these early photographs, you can see eucalypts in the background, because the house was built amongst the scrub. Some of the fruit trees have already got going there. Now here we have part of the formal English garden, which is what Edwin started to plant. Can you see the wires or rods of an arbour immediately behind these two people, and another one over to the right? There were many arbours around the garden in the beginning of those days. That's Alison Ashby again, and this one I think is another aunt. I think this one's Auntie Louie. I think, but I'm not positive, that what you can see in the middle distance in front of the eucalypt trees is the beginning of the vine trellis, of which you'll hear more later. Here they are, the photos taken from the front door of Wittunga, looking towards the front gate, which you can't quite see, but behind the roses, which have started the formal garden in front of the house, you can see the she oak and still some eucalypts. Alison Ashby there looks about perhaps 8 or 9, and as the family moved there in 1902, you may not be surprised to learn that many of these photos didn't have dates on them. And so many years ago, with the help of Alison, I went through some of these old albums and we put on them as much information as we could work out. Frequently, we had to decide ages of things from the pets which were shown, the dogs or the cats in the pictures. Alison would say, that one's Rover, or that one's Crusoe, or that one's something or other else. Therefore, this must be 1900 and something. Now we're looking down from the road coming from Blackwood. That's the main Shepherd's Hill Road leading down towards Flinders University. A nice winding bush track. That's Wittunga House as it was to begin with, and you can see the front gate of Wittunga. What a lot of lovely trees. The ones with the white stems, they're the South Australian blue gum, Eucalyptus leucoxylon, and quite a lot of she oaks through there too. And plenty of understory plants as well. Sherborne Road goes off on our left. This is what we called the top dam. This was built this is now about 1914, this one. This was built, scooped out to provide water for irrigating the garden. There were tanks around the house to supply water for the house itself, but for the vegetable garden, for the fruit trees near the house, and for any of the plants planted in the garden, this was the water supply. This dam was filled in when Shepherd's Hill Road was enlarged, and I think it must have been about the 60s, but I haven't checked on that. Here we have the front of Wittunga. This one again is about 1914, and Esther Ashby, who was a great country girl, she was frequently the one who was driving the horses. These are Nimble and Jet. And you can see how the creepers took over very quickly in the front of the house. This is said to be 1914, and it's early 1914, because there was an event which came later in 14 which helps us to date certain things. Many of you will have heard of what's now called the Wild Garden at Wittunga. We always called it the wild part. It was always wild, it was never cleared. Here you've got orchids growing there. Many different species of orchids grew in the wild part. These are Glossodia major. You can see native grasses, you can see sedges, you can see all sorts of little understory things. A lomandra on the left, Acacia pycnantha, many other things. So that's the wild part. Here we have the first car that arrived at Wittunga. This is somewhere between 1915 and 1918. There's an electric light pole behind, and if anybody here knows when electric light was first put on in Blackwood, or if they can tell me the date of that model of Ford, then we may be able to date this exactly. There's the magazine called the Blackwood magazine, which was only published for 1 year, 1914, and in the very last part of that, December 1914, it says, 2 things are going to happen in the next year. Before the next issue of the Blackwood magazine comes out, Blackwood will have electric light and water. So electric lights there, but we never had another issue of the Blackwood magazine. So obviously electric light did come before the next issue. You'll see the pipe going around the front rosary, which has now grown considerably. You'll see a pipe on the other side of the driveway. And you'll notice the fronds of some palm trees. A rosary with palm trees is what the front garden of Wittunga started as. This one is, I think I'm right in saying 1917, and electric light poles, they're certainly well and truly there. No Stobie poles yet, these came before the Stobies, but that's the front gate of Wittunga. And in 1917, for the first time, you can see the sign Wittunga is on the gate. The track leading down towards Flinders University is getting a little wider, but it's still very much a country road. There's mistletoe on the eucalypts, isn't there? Mistletoe evolved with the eucalypts. It belongs there. Now we're looking straight on to the house of Wittunga through the gate. And here's the first addition to the house. The gabled extension on the right-hand side. That was put on at the end of 1914 because during 1914 Edwin Ashby was very ill indeed, so that he decided that he would have to give up going to work every day in Adelaide, and instead he left the firm of Saunders and Ashby and started his own real estate firm, working from his office. That new room called the study, that was Edwin Ashby's office. So once you see that on the western side of Wittunga House, you know it's post-1914. This is 1917, the same date and actually taken the same month as the preceding photograph. This is taken from just uphill from Sherborne Road. We're looking actually across Sherborne Road towards Wittunga. Do you notice that there are ash trees planted in Sherborne Road? 1917. Those ash trees arrived in Sherborne Road, or maybe the year before. Those ash trees are still there. Here's some more of the formal English garden. Plants from various places, some South African, some Mediterranean region. And the south side of the house has no balcony there. This again was 1917. At about this time, or a little later, the older son Ivan, who was a medical student at Adelaide University, was becoming unwell. He had diabetes before insulin was available here. When he graduated in medicine, he worked at the Children's Hospital as one of the doctors there. He became less and less well and did many experiments on himself. He used himself as a guinea pig, and he published a lot of papers about how to treat diabetes from his experience. And actually, in his mid-20s, got his DSc? No, Doctor of Medicine, MD. Is that right? Yes, MD, for his work on diabetes, using himself as a guinea pig. But he died when he was only 27 years old. Insulin was not yet available here. Edwin Ashby did go to America to try and see if he could bring something back to help his son. And incidentally, of course, he brought back seeds of many plants which got added to the garden. Time has passed again. It's now 1919. This is on the southern side of the railway line, the other side of what is now the Botanic Gardens. The younger son, Keith Ashby, wanted to go onto the land. He had been an apprentice to some relatives in Tasmania who were a farming family specialising in apples and pears. And this is one of the areas that was first planted with fruit trees. This area was not scrubland when the family moved to Blackwood. This was already cleared. And this section of the orchard was called the Wittunga Orchard, the name which had been given to the area by a family who came from New Zealand. This small section of the orchard was called the Pears, and it is close to where the admin buildings are now, by the little shelter next to the lake. This is the beginnings of the lake. This was called the Big Dam, and the water which came rushing down Shepherd's Hill Road, or Cliff Street as it was called then, came into this particular section. This big dam was enlarged in 1920, and the photo was taken at that time. This large dam provided the water for irrigating the orchard on both sides of the railway line, and also irrigating part of the garden. No tractors, it was horses pulling the various implements, ploughing up the orchard. Here we've got great-grandmother Lucy Coleman on her 90th birthday in 1921. I don't think all grandmothers would like to be dressed like that all the time, but all the photographs I've ever seen of her, she was wearing things rather similar to that. I believe she was a very compassionate, loving person, but she always looks fairly severe in her photographs. She was the one that read stories to my father when he was a little boy. And there are many tales told about her and how apparently severe she was, and yet how loving with the children. 1919, and the front of the garden of Wittunga with a little hedge around the rosemary and palm trees now, and still you can see the pipes for the water with sprinklers in them. This is 4 generations of the women of Wittunga. I'm not in that one, that's my elder sister Hazel. I arrived a few weeks after that photo was taken. That's my mother holding Hazel, and you can see the inevitable dog in the foreground, can you? The little girl's got one of her hands down on it. Great-grandmother only lived a little while longer than this. She lived long enough to hold me on her knee, but I haven't got a photo of that here tonight. And there we have Alison Ashby, who at this stage was already adding to her paintings, and Esther Ashby. It was Esther who did a lot of managing of the farm of Wittunga. She came from a farming background, and that was a business she knew well. Edwin was, yes, he was interested in the farm, but he had his real estate job, and he was so interested in collecting plants for the garden, which he did at every possible opportunity, that it was Esther who did a lot of managing until Keith Ashby, my father, had returned from Tasmania and was able to take over. The garden kept extending. The formal garden kept creeping further and further into the scrub. Here's the little track going down into the wild part, and the formal garden creeping towards it. The years, the 1920s, the garden developed amazingly. This is Alison Ashby with one of the lambs and one of the cats. Behind her you can see raised beds. Edwin Ashby was one of those people who kept having bright ideas and putting them into practice. He had observed that many Australian plants needed good drainage, so he developed raised beds and put rocks around them. there was no shortage of sprinklers. You see all those lines of sprinklers. Much water had to be pumped by the windmills to the tanks and then irrigated the garden. Can you see behind the behind the eucalypt on the right, there's a vine trellis of which you'll hear more later. Inside that vine trellis there were many different varieties of table grapes. Edwin Ashby was very fond of grapes. The sprinklers in full blast. The shrubs are growing taller. Another one of the same area but looking the other direction. These linear beds were called the Maluka beds. The story has it that originally they were to be called the Melaleuca beds, but S. Ashby said that'll be too difficult for people to remember. Let's call them the Maluka beds from Where the Never Never, because that's where the boss could always be found. This shot's taken from the roof of Wittunga, looking up towards Blackwood. You can see the palm trees and the rosary in the front garden and the inevitable sprinklers. We're looking towards Sherborne Road, and beyond that the tennis court. The tennis court was part of the Wittunga property, and the tank that you can see is not S.A. Water's tank in Blackwood. That's the tank that the water was pumped to from the big dam on a very high metal stand, and that enabled water to be reticulated and the parts of the orchard which were close to the house. By the time that last shot was taken, Keith and Edith Ashby, Edith being my mother, had their home Allenby next to the tennis court you saw. This is Edwin Ashby again. He's now moved to Western Australia to collect plants. The reason for going to Western Australia was twofold. He'd been there before. He was a very committed member of the Society of Friends, or Quakers, and he was very anxious to visit all the families of Quakers living in Western Australia who were scattered about the country but isolated from other members. Edwin went with his nephew, Watson Coleman, in 1930 and spent about 8 weeks in Western Australia, motoring around, visiting friends and collecting plants and collecting seeds. I like this picnic party. You see they're boiling the billy, and Edwin's eating with a knife and fork on his knee, and Watson is taking that photograph. You can see the string going from his hand to the camera. They had an absolutely marvellous time. Edwin kept a diary in which he recorded what they did. Here we are, Thursday the 21st, got bogged in trying to regain High Road, but got out and got to the Duns by 5 p.m. July the 22nd, spent the day in Juna Sandplains. 23rd, collected 5 verticordia and posted plants. Yes, parcels of plants kept coming back from Western Australia. Sometimes he collected seeds, but frequently he collected plants. He always believed that if you collected the plants very small in the wild, that was a good way to go. And he used to wrap them in wet newspaper and then more layers of dry paper, and they were either brought home if he was collecting somewhere close to home, or posted back, as happened when he was in WA. disaster. The garden had been getting on wonderfully. Edwin was doing all the things he loved best, collecting, building up his collections of birds, chitons, butterflies, and his collections of plants in Wittunga. And then, March the 9th, 1934, a bushfire came. March the 9th is rather late in the season for a bushfire, but that year, 1934, was a year of great heat waves. You'll notice the advertiser tells us extensive bushfires completely destroy house and orchards at Blackwood. In those days, as now, the newspapers don't always get it totally right. The orchards were not destroyed, but yes, the house was. Furniture from Wittunga was dragged out onto the main road, what's now Shepherd's Hill Road. Esther Ashby had been bedridden for about a year before this fire went through Wittunga. She was dragged out in her bed and also left in the middle of the road. Nobody knew where the fire was going to go next. That day, March the 9th, 1934, was the most terrifying day I've ever known. I was at Blackwood Primary School. We knew there was a terrible fire somewhere. We couldn't see anything. There was smoke everywhere. There was, in fact, a fire with a front of 5 miles, a very strong north wind, and the fire was coming from Belair direction towards Blackwood. The headmaster wouldn't allow us to go home from school at lunchtime because he didn't know just where the fire was and where it was going to. Most children used to go home for lunch in those days from Blackwood School. Eventually we were allowed to go home. My older sister and I found each other, bawling our heads off like all the rest of the children. We couldn't find our younger brother. We'd quite forgotten that he wasn't well that day and he hadn't gone to school. However, eventually we went running down the hill towards home, crying our eyes out. It was very terrible. When we got home, Mother had put on eggs to boil on the wood stove for our lunch. Not surprising, she'd forgotten to take them off. We had hard-boiled eggs to eat, sitting down the cellar, still crying. You try eating hard-boiled eggs while you're crying. It's not very easy. Yes, the house was totally destroyed. It was very hot. There'd been about a week of temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And Mr. Bromley said there would be likely a cool change tomorrow. All sorts of records were broken, if that was any consolation. There were no refrigerators, and the shortage of ice made it all the more difficult. People were collapsing at tennis. And after the fire, what next? Our home across Sherborne Road, Allonby, was not burnt. The creepers on the house were burnt. The wood in the wood heap outside the back door was burnt. Most of our garden was burnt, but the house was left standing. So everybody who was living in Wittunga, which was quite a few people at that stage, came and lived at our home, Allonby. My mother had 13 people in the house while Wittunga was being rebuilt. That can't have been easy with a wood stove, no refrigerator, no washing machine. But we slept around the balcony, we slept all over the place. No, the orchard wasn't burnt. You can see the orchard on the south side of the railway line. And in the grazing paddocks, the sheep were still there. Keith had plenty to do on the farm. For Edwin Ashby, it was devastating. Not all of the garden, but a large part of the garden had been injured in some way. The house was destroyed. The formal part of the garden had gone. But there were still plenty of Australian plants growing in the garden. There were still some South African plants. He was never daunted, so he decided to concentrate on the plants. He couldn't rebuild the bird collections which had been destroyed, the bird skins, the chitons, the butterflies, and all those other things had been lost. But the plants he could build up again. A garden's a very dynamic thing. It doesn't stay still. Very soon he had set up Wittunga nurseries, Edwin Ashby and Son. This is the front page of the catalogue. Native shrubs at 2 shillings each. He had now developed a new way of growing Australian plants. He was quite convinced that the plants didn't need surface watering. Sprinklers were out. Subsoil watering was in. The part of the garden which became known as the Never Never had been established about this time, and this showed the new, what he called, or what became to be known as, the Ashby system of gardening. You dig a saucer of soil, you put it all up around the edges of the saucer, about 5 feet across, about 4 inches deep. No sprinklers, you just soak that saucer with water about every 3 weeks, and the plants will thrive, and thrive they did. Alpine rockery plants were also something that he was advocating. These you could buy slightly more cheaply. He was a great promoter of Australian plants. He gave many lectures. He wrote articles for the newspaper. The Express and Journal of the time had an article once a week for 50 weeks of the year, telling you how to grow all the different native plants. He was telling you this from the experience he'd gained in Wittunga Garden itself. He also wrote a chapter in a book which had a title, I think, called Australian Plants. The book unfortunately is undated, but I believe it was finally published in 1940. At the time of publishing this catalogue, there were 300 different Australian plants, which Edwin Ashby said were available from Wittunga nurseries. That was 1936. When the book came out in 1939-1940, Edwin was claiming to have 771 species of native plants growing. He corresponded with many people, and one of them was Constance Eardley. Maybe some of you remember her. It was Con Eardley who lectured me in botany at the Adelaide University, and she was one of the many people that visited Wittunga frequently and who also corresponded with Edwin Ashby. And after Con Eardley had died, in sorting through the papers in the botany department at Adelaide, we found correspondence between her and Edwin Ashby. As well as having the nursery, giving lectures, writing articles and so on, he also encouraged as many people as possible to come to Wittunga and look around the garden. He was still keen on growing succulents. Here he's looking at some fine detail in the succulent bed with a visitor from Tasmania. The tree on the right-hand side is Prunus posadi. This prunus was one that flowered very well, and in the shade of it there were many family gatherings. This is one of the last photos of Edwin that I've been able to find. This was 1939. It was about this time that I began to realise just what a valuable man he was. I decided that it would be a good idea if I learnt one new plant name each week from him. I should really have started much earlier. one doesn't realise how valuable the older generation's knowledge is until that person's no longer with you. We'll just go back if I can find the right thing. Because Edwin Ashby died in 1941. The garden had grown, it was very widely known. It contained a huge number of plants, both Australian, Mediterranean, South African. But 1941, the dynamic force behind it died. His wife Esther had been bedridden for about 10 years and she died in early 1943, less than 2 years after he had died. With both grandparents gone, Keith and Edith, with us 4 children, moved across the road into the house of Wittunga. Alison Ashby no longer had elderly parents to look after. She was able to blossom forth and do some of the things she'd always wanted to do. She spent more time in the garden. She went collecting plants which were added to the garden. She was also able to do more painting, and she went overseas. Not long after she'd gone overseas, the next member of the household died. That was my mother in 1947. This was a time of great sadness for all of us. Keith could not do all the work in the garden and all the work on the farm. He concentrated on the farm. Whoops, we've gone the wrong way. Apples and pears were doing well. Grazing land was still there. However, Blackwood was no longer quite the place it had been. There were more and more houses being built. The water, the groundwater in the area was brackish, and part of the orchard had been watered from a bore. The fruit trees began dying. Where there was orchard, there was now grazing land. You can see new houses in the background. That's going over towards where Craigburn now is. Still some fruit trees left in the far right, but grazing on the rest of this land. It was about this time that Keith Ashby remarried. He married Hannah Elizabeth Savage from Sydney. This was wonderful for Keith. Our generation, my generation, we had all grown up, left home, gone away. With Elizabeth Ashby to help him, Keith was able to take things a little more easily. They travelled. But the days of the orchard and the farming land were becoming numbered. Rates and taxes were going up. Wittunga was paying the rates and taxes for building blocks. This was now a suburban area. The fruit trees in the home garden below the house, they were dying too. Behind the fruit trees you can see the vine trellis. The vine trellis that had 25 and more named varieties of table grapes. You can see the eucalypt trees of the wild part. But the orchard is dying. Rates and taxes were high. If you take out the fruit trees and plant more garden, who will look after the garden? It was at this time that Keith was pondering more and more what he should do about Wittunga Garden. None of us of my generation were in a position to live there, to look after the garden, could afford its upkeep. In speaking with various people, Keith felt that the right thing to do was to give the garden, which had been built up over the years by his father before him and by Alison and himself to a lesser extent, he felt the right thing to do was to give the garden to the state so that it wouldn't be destroyed. Professor J.B. Cleland was a great one in encouraging him in this belief. And so the decision was made in consultation with my generation. It was a family decision that Wittunga Garden should be given to the state. The timing of this, it was decided that because those of my generation were scattered around the world, and Hazel was going to come from Scotland in 1965. Beth was going to come from South Africa the same year for a visit. My brother and I and our spouses, we lived in South Australia. It was going to be the first time that ever the four of us, with our spouses, had been together. And Keith thought this was an opportune time to hand over the garden. J.B. Cleland's lurking behind that pole on the right. So accordingly, on the 15th of October 1965, we have Keith Ashby making his speech, saying with great pleasure and pride how he wanted the garden to be kept for all to enjoy for always. So 30 acres of land and the house and all the outbuildings and the nursery, all of these he was bequeathing to the state during his lifetime, and this was with the full support and approval of all the family. If you think the figure behind is threatening, that's the then director of the gardens, Noel Lothian, watching to see that Keith Ashby did in fact sign that document. Mr. Peters is on Keith's right-hand side. He was the chairman of the board. And the premier of the day was Walsh. Right? Wrong? There was a big garden party. Con Erdley is the one in the foreground with her back to us, white hat. It looks very like John and Joe Prescott next to her, but it may not be. This was the audience that heard Keith Ashby handing over the garden for the enjoyment of everybody, for all future generations. And that is the marquee on the front lawn outside Wittunga. After the ceremony, everybody walked around the garden. This is the section which used to be the home orchard with many different varieties of fruit trees and nut trees in it. It was planted in terraces, alternately Australian and South African plants. There'd always been a very strong emphasis on South African plants, and that continued. Because my family never liked to waste anything, and some of the fruit trees hadn't quite died, there were still a number of fruit trees left behind. There's a lemon tree there which was still bearing good fruit. And the vine trellis you can see in the background. And a lovely South Australian blue gum with mistletoe on it behind. The Sunday Mail wrote up the occasion. 30 acres in the heart of Blackwood to the Botanic Gardens. The local newspaper, the Coromandel, told the story the next week too. And inside this paper there were more photos and more articles. Many of the visitors were interviewed as to what they thought of it all. They all thought it was a good idea. This picture I call Tranquility. It was a time of great peace and tranquility for the family. We all knew, I hope, that Wittunga would be safe for always. Keith Ashby, with new vigour, started collecting more plants, propagating more plants, planting more plants. He now had the help of the Botanic Gardens. The first member of staff to join him was Bruce Grivell. Bruce had joined the Botanic Gardens staff hoping to work in Mount Lofty Gardens, which were right next door to his home. Bruce initially was very disappointed when he was told to go and work at Wittunga. However, Bruce and my father met. I was going to say they fell in love. They really enjoyed each other. And from then on, Bruce was one of the family. And for Bruce, Wittunga was his garden too. New erica beds were planted. Much colour, much joy. The shrubs grew bigger. We have a bed of Australian plants on the left here with the border of the Dampiera. The wild patch you can see in the background. There was still some of the farmland which hadn't been turned into garden. In fact, when the 30 acres was handed over, about 5 acres was garden. The rest was what one might call prime real estate these days. And there's Helen's horse, Pasha, one of the last animals to graze on Wittunga. This shot is at the end of Sherborne Road, with the railway line behind and a train going past. This was the last area that Keith developed. Some grey box, Eucalyptus microcarpa, in what used to be the cow paddock. The little bit of orchard on the north side of the line had been mostly cleared out, and he started planting here. And Noel Lothian said, "That's far enough, Keith, you've gone far enough." Anyway, Keith didn't live much after that, and so that was in fact the last part of the garden that he developed. Keith Ashby died in December 1971. Under the terms of the gift, only Keith and his wife Elizabeth were allowed to remain in the house. Elizabeth was very keen to stay in the house, and she did for some time. In the garden there was great activity, because now, with Keith's passing, the Botanic Gardens were to take over the total running of Wittunga. There was great activity amongst the staff. Stalls, the stables where the horses were kept, the blacksmithy, the tool shed, the harness room. These were all got rid of. The bulldozers had a fine old time. The apple store, which had been the site of packing of thousands of cases of fruit for export, that remained, but all the other old buildings went. That's now called the barn. We always called it the apple store. Quite logical, that's where you stored the apples. On the south side of the railway line, which had been orchard and then grazing land, houses popped up. This was not part of the Botanic Gardens. I guess that's what it would have looked like if we'd not given 30 acres to the Botanic Gardens. Houses would have been everywhere, wouldn't they? Within Wittunga itself, preparations continued. There must be a car park if you're going to have it open to the public. There must be pathways. 3 miles of pathways were made. The car park was made. This blue gum was still standing, but you can see pathways beyond, leading up to where the Banksias are on the hill by the school. Bruce Grivell, who had enjoyed working so much with Keith, was still one of the staff in the gardens, and there he is preparing for the opening. And the opening of the garden came on September the 14th, 1975. It was Sir Mark Oliphant, the governor, who opened the garden. Many people attended. Sir Mark Oliphant was a very good choice. He's a great conservationist. As he unveiled the plaque, he spoke of his interest in the native vegetation, his wish that it should be preserved, his wish that everybody should treasure the native plants of Australia. I heard him express very similar sentiments recently when he unveiled the plaque at the Mark Oliphant Conservation Park near Mount Lofty recently. A few months after the official opening, one of the family took this photo of Elizabeth Ashby, Keith's widow, with Bruce Grivell by the plaque overlooking the lake. It's now a lake. It used to be a dam. And what does it feel like to be a member of a family whose home and garden has become a public place? As I walk from my house on the other side of Sherborne Road, across the road, through the gate, into Wittunga, I think of the various things I've known. I pass the pecan nut tree, one of the earliest plantings. The tree is still there, growing tall. I note it with satisfaction. On my right-hand side, I look for the Eucalyptus ficifolia, the one that Alison painted so beautifully, the glorious flowers. That's gone. In its place is a Eucalyptus calophylla, which is growing apace. A little further down, I see the stump of the Prunus posadi tree, the prunus under which so many family gatherings were held. That tree has gone. Things come and things go. I get to this spot. Where is the vine trellis? I can see a very ordinary gravel path, a little piece of very ordinary grass lawn. This is where the vine trellis used to be, I remember. The vine trellis stood there for more than half a century. A historic planting of vines, 25 named varieties of table grapes. I feel sad. Why should that have gone? But now I see a beautiful tree. This one's Eucalyptus neurofolia, the Kangaroo Island mallee. A very important tree to me, a magnificent tree. Edwin Ashby collected the seed of this from Kangaroo Island when he went there to campaign to have Flinders Chase preserved. He brought the seed back, and this is the tree that grew from it. Again, I see with great pleasure another tree I knew so well. This is the persimmon tree that we climbed as children and swung on the branches. And we learned to eat the fruit and not get a furry tongue. I walk to where the Never Never was. I walk to the wild part. I can't recognise them. Where are the understory plants in the wild part? That is a bit of sadness. There are no orchids, there are no lilies. There's mulch, end of the 20th century mulch. The Never Never, which showed the method of Ashby's system for growing Australian plants. That's lost. That's a sadness. I walk further. With great joy I see the proteas. I see the ericas and the Australian plants, the banksias. This banksia is Banksia ashbyi, named after Edwin Ashby. How wonderful it is to see all these plants growing. How much I hope that those with power will not destroy the integrity of the garden for some short-term monetary benefit, but that they will keep the garden and honour the wishes of those who gradually built up the garden and gave it with so much loving care to the people of South Australia for all future generations. Thank you.
Perhaps I can start the ball rolling by asking, under the terms of the gift, how secure is the garden? Would it in fact be possible for the government to dispose of it?
Shall I quote something which was not in fact referring to Wittunga but to something rather equivalent? Morally, no. Legally, yes. I would say under the terms of the agreement it's safe, but I think that's the answer one would be given. I hope it's safe.
I was wondering what the status of the garden is now.
What the status?
Yes.
Well, it's on the interim heritage list, right?
Provisionally entered on the 3rd of April on the State Heritage Register.
It's on the Register of the National Estate.
Yes.
It's a place of historic significance.
Yes.
Did the railways ever have access to your dam?
No. The dam for the railway, there was one in Belair Park, from which water was obtained for steam engines. Yes?
From where does the water come now for the watering of the garden?
Out of the pipes. the dam, which later became a reservoir, was used when the property was a farm. But people like looking at water, therefore the dam became a lake, and it's not used for irrigating the garden at all. That means various changes have happened. The island in the middle of, when it was a dam, it had an island in the winter time, a peninsula in the autumn time. Now the island is an island all the time, and I think very soon it will cease to be an island. I think you will find it finally collapsing.
Where's the name come from?
It is an Aboriginal name, but it wasn't a local Aboriginal name for that area. You'll know that many Aboriginal words end inga, unga, onga, and it usually means something in relation to water. And I think it is a place next to water for Wittunga. It just was an Aboriginal word that the family liked.
Was she your aunt?
What happened to Alison? Alison died in 1987 after painting many paintings and travelling around Australia collecting things. And there was another part to Wittunga, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. And another part of the farm, which was in Alison Ashby's name, she gave to the National Trust, and that's Wittunga. Yes.
Or were there some...
No, it was all built back the same way, the same number of rooms. The walls were still standing. You didn't see a photograph of the balcony on the south side of the house, but that was put up when grandmother was bedridden. So that was up before the fire and was put up again after the fire. Amazingly enough, some trees which were growing right next to the south side of the house survived. Even a camellia which was within a couple of metres of the wall. And I think it's still there, isn't it, Richard? Mm.